Hi, welcome to the Heathen Trans Girl podcast with me, your host, Kaya Fox. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the show. My name is Kaya. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a practicing Norse heathen. These episodes are an effort on my part to compile all the different attestations of various deities and topics in the Norse lore into one place for your listening pleasure and research, whatever you want. If you're washing dishes and need something passive to listen to, you want some Norse content, awesome. If you're a practicing heathen like me and you're trying to do some more research, I hope this is a help to you and it can connect some dots. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about Angrboda, the mother of Fenrir, Hel, and Jormungandr. Now, since there are only 2 attestations by name in the lore, we're also going to be taking a look at Ironwood, aka Jarnvid, the home of the wolf-bearing giantess, and a few other characters throughout the lore who are depicted as riding wolves. Everything that I will be reading from today is either public domain or I have the author's or publisher's permission. So big thank you to Carolyne Larrington for her permission to read some of her translation of the Poetic Edda, as well as Jackson Crawford's team over at Hackett Publishing for permission to read some of Crawford's translation of the Poetic Edda. Running through the sources real quick before we get going, we're reading from the Poetic Edda, Henry Adams Bellows translation, 1936, Poetic Edda, Carolyne Larrington translation, 1996, Poetic Edda, Jackson Crawford translation, 2015, and the Prose Edda, Arthur Gilchrist Brodeur translation, 1916. In the future, if I notice I have made any mistakes or left anything out from this episode, I will come back and edit the episode or mention it in a future one. So that said, I made a little mistake in the last episode about Valkyries, and I believe I said that I thought Snorri was the only one who made the connection between Sigurdrifa and Brynhild. But as I was doing my research for this episode, I noticed in Helride Brynhildr, or Brynhild's Helride in the Poetic Edda, Brynhild herself actually attests that it was her in the hall surrounded by fire that Sigurd awoke. Thus, Brynhild makes the connection between her and the character of Sigurdrifa. So that is my edit for the past episode. And with that, let's get started with today's episode. We have about 9 different passages from the lore that we're going to be reading from today, and they will all be listed in the episode description down below. All right, so this first passage is really the big one. It's like the main mention, and it comes from the Prose Edda, written or compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. This is from the book of Gylfaginning, chapter 34, Brodeur translation. Angrboda was the name of a certain giantess in Jotunheim, with whom Loki got 3 children. One was Fenris wolf, the second Jormungandr, that is the Midgard serpent. The third is Hel. But when the gods learned that this kindred was nourished in Jotunheim, and when the gods perceived by prophecy that from this kindred great misfortune should befall them, and since it seemed to all that there was great prospect of ill, first from the mother's blood, and yet worse from the father's, then All-Father sent gods thither to take the children and bring them to him. The rest of this passage goes on to describe a little bit more about the 3 children of Angrboda. They are fairly well known, and I'm actually going to make an episode about each one of them in the future, so I won't go too much more into the story here, but I think a lot can be gleaned about Angrboda's character by nature of connection to the rest of her family, both Loki and her 3 children. We can also look at the location, being Jotunheim, some of the other Jotuns described that can possibly inform Angrboda's character. I did want to point out that the Old Norse word that has been translated as giantess here is spelled Gygr, Gygr, and that is a word that will be used more in some of these future passages that we're going to look at. So just pointing that out now. The second attestation of Angrboda that we get by name comes from Voluspa and Skamma, or the short prophecy of the seeress, also known as Hyndlulioð, or the Lay of Hyndla, sometimes broken up into two different poems, sometimes smashed into the same one. So this is coming from the Poetic Edda, stanza 40 in both Crawford and Larrington, or stanza 11 in Bellows, and we'll be touching on all three. Crawford translates, Loki fathered a wolf with Angrboda. He produced Sleipnir with Svaðilfari, but there was one child worse than all the others of those born to Blist's brother Loki. Larrington renders this as Loki got the wolf on Angrboda, and Bellows translates, the wolf did Loki with Angrboda win. I think it is fairly accepted here that the wolf they are referring to is Fenrir, although the next few lines don't necessarily seem related to Angrboda, so the Sleipnir bore he to Svaðilfari, Svaðilfari being the horse of the Jotun whom Loki did the things with and had Sleipnir. And then the next line, this is Bellows, by the way. The worst of marvels seemed the one that sprang from the brother of Blist then. We're not sure who this is referring to, the worst of marvels, or one child worse than the other, according to Crawford. It could potentially be Hel or Jormungandr, or another unspecified child of Loki. But the mention by name of Angrboda is connecting her and Loki as parents of the wolf, usually accepted to be Fenrir. All right, and that is all we have for the named attestations of Angrboda. The next passage that I'm going to read from is probably one of the more common connections that we get to Angrboda. In this, we see the possible connection of the vulva, or the seeress in this poem, to Angrboda by way of Odin calling her, the seeress, the mother of three þursa, usually translated as giants, ogres, or monsters. So this comes from Baldrs draumar stanzas 4 and 13 or 14, depending on the translation, from the Poetic Edda. I'll be reading Larrington and Bellows both. The context here is that Odin is riding to Hel to seek answers to the cause of Baldr's bad dreams by way of reviving the corpse of a vulva. At first he gives a false name, but later she identifies him and then he variously identifies her back. So Larrington stanza 4. Then Odin rode by the eastern doors, where he knew the seeress's grave to be. He began to speak the corpse reviving spell for the wise woman, until, reluctantly, she arose. Bellows translation of stanza 4. Then Odin rode to the eastern door. There he knew well was the wise woman's grave. Magic he spoke, and mighty charms, till spellbound she rose, and in death she spoke. The word that is translated as seeress or wise woman here is Volu, Volu, and then throughout the rest of the poem, Odin refers to her as Volva, Volva, usually translated as seeress or wise woman, or sometimes just as Volva. And then skipping ahead to stanzas 13 in the Larrington translation. You are not way tame as I thought. Rather, you are Odin, the ancient sacrifice. You are not a prophetess, nor a wise woman. Rather, you are the mother of 3 ogres. Bellows translation. No wise woman art thou, nor wisdom hast. Of giants 3, the mother art thou. And I'm going to read the Old Norse just because it's fun. Erta tu volva, nevis kona, heldur ertu þriggja þursa móðir. And those last 3 words, þriggja þursa móðir, mother of 3 þursa, 3 giants, 3 ogres, 3 monsters, is where we get the connection to Angrboda. Angrboda's 3 monsters being Jormungandr, Hel, and Fenrir, if that was not obvious. So, thinking about the character of Angrboda, if we accept this as a connection, Odin's accusation of this vulva being the mother of 3 Thurs, that being Angrboda, his accusation of that being true, then we can start to layer on these meanings of seeress, prophetess, vulva, onto the character, the idea of Angrboda and what she represents. Now again, it's not used by name, it's not a definitive connection, but I think it is one of the more commonly accepted connections. The next most common connection that I have seen is between Angrboda and the giantess of Ironwood, spoken of both in the Poetic and the Prose Edda. So first we're going to read from Voluspa, Poetic Edda, stanza 40, Bellows translation. The giantess old in Ironwood sat in the east and bore the brood of Fenrir. Among these, one in monster's guise was soon to steal the sun from the sky. So that is just one stanza, and it is definitely worth breaking down some of the Old Norse in this passage. So the giantess old in Ironwood, the Old Norse word for ironwood is Jarnvidi, Jarnvidi, and the word brood for in the east and bore the brood of Fenrir. The word that was translated as brood in Old Norse is kindir, Kindir. And that word literally, it translates to kind. So the kind of Fenrir, not necessarily like the immediate family unit, but here it's actually referencing the kind of Fenrir, Fenrir's kind being wolves, in general. The next Old Norse word worth mentioning is, and among these one in monster's guise. The Old Norse words for in monster's guise are trolls hami. So troll here was translated as monster, and guise, the word is Hami, related to the word hamr, Hamr. And that word is variously described as form, shape, body, sometimes even skin or cloak. It also has connections to these ideas of shape shifting or changing one's hamr. So in this, among these, in monsters, guys, in trolls' shape, in trolls' skin, was soon to steal the sun from the sky. I'm not sure why Bellows translated sun, because the Old Norse word is Tungls, Tungls, translated, which literally just means moon. Crawford translates that last line as, among them is a certain one who bites the moon in a troll's shape. And then when we jump to our next passage in Gylfaginning, we'll see it again translated as moon. Okay, now we are going to jump to the Prose Edda. This is Gylfaginning chapter 12, Brodeur translation. In this, Snorri quotes that stanza that we just read in the Poetic Edda, but gives a little bit of narrative before the quote, which adds some interesting context to it. So I will go ahead and read from chapter 12 of Gylfaginning. Then Gangleri said, "What is the race of the wolves?" Har answered, "A witch, Gigr, dwells to the east of Midgard, in the forest called Ironwood, Jarnvidr. In that wood dwell the troll women, Trollkonur, who are known as Ironwood women, Jarnvidr. The old witch, Gamla Gigr, bears many giants, Jotna, for sons, and all in the shape of wolves. And from this source are these wolves sprung. The saying runs thus, from this race shall come one that shall be mightiest of all. He that is named Moonhound, Managarm. He shall be filled with the flesh of all those men that die, and he shall swallow the moon, and sprinkle with blood the heavens and all the air. Therefore shall the sun lose her shining, and the winds in that day shall be unquiet and roar on every side. So it says in Voluspa, eastward dwells the old one in Ironwood, and there gives birth to Fenrir's brethren. There shall spring from them all a certain one, the moon's taker, in troll's likeness. He is filled with flesh of fey men, reddens the gods' seats with ruddy blood gouts. Swart becomes sunshine in summers after, the weather all shifty. Wit ye yet, or what? So these last two passages that we read are the only mentions of Ironwood, or Jarnvidr, that we have in the lore. And this is one of the more common connections that we get to Angrboda. Angrboda often being seen as the old Gigr, translated as giantess or witch, depending on the translator, who bears Jotna's sons in wolf's likeness in Jarnvidr. There, in Jarnvidr, Ironwood, also dwell troll women who are referred to as Jarnvidr. Okay, so this is not to say that all these words are necessarily interchangeable. They might be to some extent, I don't know. What we have here in the Old Norse is the old witch in Ironwood is called a Gigr, Gygr, who has Jotna, Jotna, sons who are in the likeness of wolves. There are also Trollkonur, or troll women, who dwell there. Now, as we move away from Ironwood, we're going to stick with some of this imagery. So the next 3 passages that I'm going to read from, one of them is a gigr with a wolf, one of them is referencing a troll with a wolf, one of them is referencing a jotun with a wolf. So I'll just go ahead and read these next 3 passages and let you make some connections. First up of these 3 is Hirokin, the gigr with a wolf. This comes from Gylfaginning, chapter 49 in the Prose Edda, Brodeur translation. Death of Baldr. Then word was sent to Jotunheim after that giantess, Gigi, who is called Hirokin. When she had come, riding on a wolf, and having a viper for bridle, then she leapt off the steed, and Odin called to 4 berserkers to tend the steed, but they were not able to hold it until they had felled it. Then Hirokin went to the prow of the boat and thrust it out at the first push, so that fire burst from the rollers, and all lands trembled. Next we have Helgi's þriggja, a troll with a wolf. This comes from Helga Hjörvarðssonar, stanzas 30 and 34 from the Poetic Edda, Larrington translation. So Helgi's, this is the hero of the story, Helgi's brother, quote, Haven was going home alone from the woods one Yule evening, and he met a troll woman, Þrokonu. She was riding a wolf and had serpents as reins. He refuses her company. In response, she foretells his oath to take Helgi's bride for himself. He makes such an oath and then is so remorseful that he goes to Helgi to repent. Helgi says that he has a duel in 3 days and not to repent because, quote, he suspected he was doomed, and it was his fetch, þriggja, who had visited Héðinn when he met the woman riding on the wolf, end quote. Now, that word þriggja is really interesting, and that is a whole nother rabbit trail off of this, which is already a rabbit trail off of the main point. So I'm going to leave that for another episode, but if you already know what a þriggja is, I leave your brain to start having fun with those connections. The last of the 3 wolf riders that we'll look at today is Hyndla, a jotun with a wolf, coming from Voluspa in skamma, aka Hyndlioð, stanza 5, Poetic Edda, Crawford translation. So in this poem, Freyja is seeking advice from the character Hyndla, who she identifies as a jotun in stanza 50, trying to get knowledge about Otar's ancestry so that Otar can receive his inheritance. So picking up with stanza 5, Freyja said, Now take a wolf out of your stable, let him walk beside my hog. Hyndla said, I doubt the hog will walk the god's road. I don't want to saddle my swift wolf. So those were our 3 mentions of riding wolves. A quick aside from that character riding wolf point, it is in this poem of Voluspa and skamma that we see a Volva, a prophetess, a seeress, being described as jotun. I could be wrong. I might have to come back and correct myself in a future episode, but I don't think we get that specificity in Baldrs draumar or Voluspa. So interesting possible tie-in between the Jotun character and the seeress character here in Voluspa and skamma. All right, now we are to our very last passage of the episode. I included this one not because it has a connection to wolves and not because it explicitly has a connection to Angrboda, but because it connects to the concept of the giantess and death. So this comes from Helride Brynhildr, or Brynhild's Hellride, the introduction, Poetic Edda, Bellows translation. After the death of Brynhild, there were made 2 balefires, one for Sigurd, and that burnt first, and on the other was Brynhild burned. And she was on a wagon, which was covered with a rich cloth. Thus it was told that Brynhild went in the wagon on Hel way, and passed by a house where dwelt a certain giantess, Gilchrist. The rest of the poem is a conversation between Brynhild and the giantess, and I think it's interesting because we get the Gilchrist, the giantess, living alongside the road to Hel. And if we reflect on some of the last few characters, Hirokin came to assist in Baldr's funeral. Helgi's þriggja was a portent of Helgi's death. In Baldr's draumar, we saw the mother of 3 þurs, both being raised from the dead and prophesizing Baldr's death. And then Angrboda's children, Hel, Fenrir, Jormungandr, are taken because of their foretold hand in the death of the Æsir. And they do eventually have a hand in that. So all of these beings seem to have some connection either to like the liminal and transitional aspect of death, or prophesizing or even enacting the necessity of death as connected with change in a way. That's how I see those concepts. I would be interested to hear if you make similar connections as this. I think that's some of my own personal reading. I try to keep most of my personal stuff out of these lore episodes, but I thought that was one connection with just like the death aspect as a whole that felt fairly obvious for me to make. As a last note, I do want to point out that I am not a mythic literalist. I don't really advocate for mythic literalism. I don't think these are like physical characters in a way. Think of them a little more metaphorically, symbolically, conceptually. In my personal Norse heathen practice, I do think there's some reality to them, but not in like a literal character sense. Okay, enough about me. Let's wrap up this episode. So, in summary, Angrboda only has 2 attestations by name. First, we saw her 3 children with Loki being taken from her. We can follow the stories of these children, Hel, Jormungandr, and Fenrir, as well as her lover Loki, to glean more about her. I will do so on this podcast in future episodes, but you are more than welcome to get a head start. The second attestation by name simply lists her and Loki as parents of the wolf. From there, we deal in possibilities and connections. While it is possible that Angrboda is the vulva that Odin speaks to in Baldr's draumar, it is only his accusation of her as the mother of 3 þurs that makes this connection. While Angrboda is spoken of as a Gilchrist from Jotunheim and the mother of a wolf, we don't see explicit mention of her connection with Ironwood, aka Jarnvid. We do see mention of an unnamed old Gilchrist in Jarnvid, where also dwell Trókona Jarnvidr. this unnamed Gígr, giantess, which bears many giant Jotna sons in the shape of wolves. Of that race comes Managarm, Moonhound. We also touched on Hirokin, Helgi's Fylgja, and Hyndla as Gígr, Troll, and Jotun who ride wolves. These characters are not necessarily Jonvidr of Ironwood, and the wolves that they ride are not necessarily the wolves born of the old Gígr of Ironwood. Now, I am not contesting anyone's personal connections, UPG or Praxis. I am simply trying to parse out what is actually said in the few primary sources that we do have. Some things that I have not talked about in this episode yet, but I thought were worth mentioning. Others have connected Angrboda to the vulva seeress of Voluspa by means of that character's similarity to the vulva of Baldrs draumar. Some have connected Angrboda to Gulveig by way of the half-burned heart that Loki eats in Voluspa and skamma, and yet more connections have been made between her and Angrboda and occasionally Vidolf. Some of these connections have been made by scholars and others by practitioners, and I will leave it up to the listeners as to which, if any, of these rabbit trails you wish to follow. As for myself and the show, we are going to focus up on her family. So, be sure to join me next time as we explore what the lore has to say about Angrboda's daughter, Hel. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this show, give it a follow, a like, a rating, whatever, depending on where you are listening. I can be reached through the comments on YouTube or via email at heathentransgirlpodcast@gmail.com. I hope you have an absolutely fabulous rest of your day and you have enjoyed listening to this episode, maybe learned something, or just had fun. Thanks. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.